This is an unauthorized assembly. Disperse immediately or face arrest." The man in the ill-fitting uniform shouted as he stormed onto my wooden deck, interrupting what had been a peaceful afternoon of grilling steaks and sharing war stories with my closest friends behind the sliding glass door. Margaret Stonefield stood with her smartphone raised, recording everything with the smug satisfaction of someone who believed she'd just orchestrated the perfect ambush. As the self-proclaimed neighborhood enforcer, she'd hired these theatrical imposters to crash my gathering, assuming I'd crumble under the pressure of what appeared to be legitimate law enforcement. What Margaret couldn't have anticipated was that she'd just sent her amateur actors directly into the lion's den on the one day when every person around my barbecue table happened to be anything but ordinary civilians. This was the day she should have researched exactly who would be attending my annual celebration. Want to discover what unfolds when someone with delusions of power picks the absolute worst possible target? Keep reading, because what happened next left everyone speechless. I was turning ribeye steaks on the grill, listening to my tactical unit teammates debate whether Danny's marinade was just teriyaki sauce mixed with garlic powder, when our 16th anniversary gathering got interrupted by what had to be the most unconvincing display of authority I'd witnessed in my entire career. 3 individuals wearing police costumes that appeared fresh from a discount costume shop burst through my entrance without announcing themselves. The apparent leader, a thin man sporting a badge that gleamed with obvious plastic shine and wearing a uniform several sizes too large, aimed what I prayed was a replica weapon at my dinner guests while bellowing about unlawful assemblies and firearms infractions. His 2 accomplices attempted to project intimidation, but one wore his badge inverted, while the other had paired his police uniform with bright white sneakers. These amateurs had no idea they just interrupted the annual reunion of Nevada's premier tactical response team. 9 veterans who'd served together through hostage rescues, narcotics raids, and anti-terrorism missions were now observing this pathetic performance with professional curiosity. I caught Rachel Thompson's attention across the patio, as our demolition specialist, who'd been yearning for excitement after 4 months behind a desk. Her subtle gesture indicated she'd already identified every error these pretenders were committing. Marcus Rodriguez, our precision marksman, was discreetly activating his phone to document what would become either crucial evidence or the most entertaining footage in tactical unit history. The remaining team members were repositioning themselves with the practiced movements that transform a backyard barbecue into a strategic advantage. Within moments, I set aside my grilling utensils and approached the costumed intruders, maintaining visible hands and a calm demeanor. "Officers, I believe there's been some misunderstanding here. May I examine your credentials and identification?" The leader's eyes darted nervously, revealing the telltale signs I'd learned to recognize. His badge wasn't merely plastic, featured a serial number beginning with China 1. His communication device was a consumer walkie-talkie from an electronics store, and his restraints were novelty handcuffs with pink fur trim. The definitive giveaway was his sidearm, which I now realized was a brightly colored water pistol covered with black paint. These weren't incompetent officers, they were performers, and particularly unconvincing ones. "We're not required to show you anything," the leader stammered, his voice breaking. "You're all being detained for illegal gathering and weapons violations." That's when Rachel began laughing, a sound that drained the color from the fake officer's face. "Weapons violations?" she repeated, wiping tears of amusement. "Friend, the only weapons present are these perfectly legal grilling tools and whatever that sad excuse for a firearm is supposed to represent." She gestured toward his water gun, which was now leaking what appeared to be food coloring onto my hardwood flooring. The other 2 imposters exchanged glances that screamed desperation, and I could see them edging toward the exit. That's when I noticed Margaret Stonefield positioned beside her luxury sedan in my driveway, phone pressed to her ear, gesturing frantically as she monitored the unfolding disaster. Margaret had been my personal nightmare since inheriting this mountain retreat from my Uncle Seven. Months ago, as the self-appointed authority figure of a neighborhood that technically existed outside any homeowners association jurisdiction, She'd dedicated herself to forcing me from what she considered her territory. She'd attempted noise violations, fabricated zoning infractions, and even tried having my property condemned for structural problems that turned out to be completely invented, but hiring theatrical performers to impersonate law enforcement and disrupt a private gathering on my land that represented a new depth of desperation. Even for her, I turned back to the Three Stooges in police costumes and decided to conclude this charade. "Here's what's going to happen," I announced loudly, enough for Margaret to hear clearly. "You three will slowly place your hands behind your heads and kneel down. Not because you're under arrest, but because you're about to be questioned by genuine law enforcement personnel." I gestured toward my 8 teammates, who had formed a semicircle around the fake officers with professional competence. "Gentlemen, meet Nevada Tactical Response Unit Alpha. We were celebrating 16 years of putting actual criminals in actual prison cells." The color vanished from the imposters' faces as reality struck them. The leader's toy weapon clattered onto the deck as his hand shot upward in surrender. "We're just actors, man. Just actors. Some woman hired us from Desert Hills Casting to perform a scene for a documentary. She claimed it was for a film about neighborhood disputes. She provided scripts and everything." His voice trembled now, and I could see perspiration forming on his forehead despite the cool mountain breeze. Behind him, his 2 partners nodded frantically, clearly prepared to implicate Margaret if it meant avoiding whatever consequences they imagined we might impose. Outside, I watched Margaret's triumphant expression dissolve into something between confusion and terror as she realized her carefully planned intimidation campaign was collapsing spectacularly. She'd expected me to be frightened, perhaps even to evacuate rather than confront what she believed were actual police officers. Instead, she was witnessing her hired performers surrender to a genuine tactical team while her entire scheme disintegrated. Before her eyes, she began pacing beside her vehicle, shouting into her phone with increasing panic. I couldn't distinguish the exact words, but her body language communicated abort mission in every conceivable way. When Margaret realized she'd just deployed actors to threaten an actual tactical response unit, her complexion turned ghostly pale. But what would truly terrorize her was only beginning. While Rachel continued her professional interrogation of our Hollywood wannabes, I found myself studying Margaret through the window with the focused attention I typically reserved for armed suspects. Something about this elaborate setup felt wrong, like discovering a genuine Rolex in a box of children's cereal. Typical neighborhood. Busybodies might file noise complaints or threaten legal action, but hiring professional performers with authentic-looking costumes and detailed scripts required planning, financial resources, and a level of desperation suggesting Margaret's motivations ran far deeper than simple desires for quiet neighborhoods and maintained landscaping. The woman standing in my driveway wasn't merely some power-hungry control freak. She was someone with substantial resources and an agenda that made my tactical instincts tingle like a danger warning. Jason Walsh, our lead performer, was revealing information faster than a burst water main under Rachel's questioning. "She contacted Desert Hills Casting 4 days ago," he said, producing a folder thick enough to use as a weapon. "Look, she didn't just hire us for a quick scene. She provided a 30-page script, fake police identification templates, even detailed background stories about community conflicts and property disputes." He handed Rachel what appeared to be a legitimate casting contract, complete with letterhead, legal terminology, and a production company name none of us recognized. She said this was for a documentary about HOA overreach, and we were supposed to represent law enforcement responding to complaints about illegal gatherings. She even hired someone claiming to be a documentary director to supervise the entire operation. This gave us detailed character profiles and motivation sheets like this was some kind of method acting exercise. What struck me as particularly clever was how Margaret had covered every possible angle to make this scam appear legitimate. The contracts made everything seem professional. The scripts gave the actors specific dialogue to memorize, and she'd even created fake production schedules and call sheets to maintain the illusion. "Where's this director now?" I asked. Jason pointed toward the driveway where Margaret was still pacing and shouting into her phone. "That's her, sir. She said she'd film everything from a distance for realism that hidden cameras would capture. Our performance better than obvious equipment. She even showed us examples of other documentary scenes she'd supposedly directed." The kid looked proud of what he thought was professional filmmaking technique, which would have been endearing if it wasn't part of an elaborate fraud. But Rachel was already 10 steps ahead. Her experience with narcotics investigations kicking in as she examined the paperwork with the attention most people reserve for lottery numbers, she said quietly, pulling me aside while Tony kept our actors entertained with stories about real police work. "This isn't just harassment. Look at these addresses." She showed me a list attached to Jason's contract containing detailed information about not just my property, but 18 other homes in the surrounding area. Every one of these families has either sold their property in the last 3 years or been involved in legal disputes with Margaret's HOA. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. Her voice had taken on the edge it acquired when she was tracking major drug operations, and I could see her mind already working through the implications. The pieces were starting to form a picture that made my tactical training itch with recognition. Margaret wasn't just targeting me. She was systematically working her way through every property owner in this area, using legal harassment, intimidation, and now fake law enforcement to force people out. "Rachel, what if this isn't about community control at all?" I said, watching Margaret's increasingly frantic phone conversation through the window. "What if she's trying to clear out this entire area for something else entirely?" Rachel nodded, grimly, already pulling out her phone. "I'm calling this in 2D. We've had reports of unusual activity in this forest area for months. Vehicles coming and going at odd hours. And if Margaret is forcing out residents systematically, there might be a reason she needs this area empty."
Oh.
That's when Margaret's phone call became loud enough for us to hear through the open windows. And what we heard made everything click into place. "I paid you people $600 each," she was screaming. "You were supposed to arrest them and clear them out. I don't care if they're real cops. You signed a contract." The irony was beautiful. She was essentially confessing to conspiracy and fraud while standing in my driveway, completely unaware that 9 trained law enforcement officers were recording every word. Tony had his phone out, capturing video, while Rachel was already speaking to someone at D headquarters, explaining the situation in the kind of calm, professional tone that meant serious federal investigations were about to begin. But more importantly, her words revealed that this wasn't about HOA compliance or neighborhood disputes. This was about forcibly removing people from their property. The real revelation came when Jason produced the payment receipts from his folder. Documents that transformed this from simple harassment into something much more sinister. "She didn't. Just pay us in cash," he said, looking increasingly nervous as he realized how deep this rabbit hole went. "She had us open a business account under the fake production company name, said it was for tax purposes and legitimate business practices. The checks came from something called Mountain Development Solutions. And when we tried to look up the company online, the website was just created last week." Rachel and I exchanged glances that confirmed what we were both thinking. This was way bigger than HOA drama. This was organized, well-funded, and involved. People with enough resources to create fake companies and elaborate cover stories. "Jason," I said, keeping my voice gentle but firm, "I need you to think very carefully about everything Margaret told you during your meetings. Did she mention anything about the land itself, about development plans, or about other people who might be involved in this project?" The kid's face went pale as memory clicked into place like a puzzle piece finding its home. "Oh God," he whispered. "She kept talking about how this area was going to be transformed soon, how she was just clearing out temporary obstacles. She said once filming was done, the whole neighborhood would look completely different, that we were helping with community improvement and economic development." Outside, Margaret had finished her phone call and was now staring at my cabin with the kind of expression you'd see on someone watching their house burn down. She'd realized that her carefully orchestrated intimidation campaign had not only failed spectacularly, but it also exposed her to a federal investigation. I could almost see the wheels turning in her head as she calculated her next move. probably weighing whether to cut her losses and run, or double down on whatever larger plan she'd been executing. When Rachel put her hand on my shoulder and told me that this forest had just appeared on DEA's radar for mysterious drug activity, I realized Margaret's war against me was about to become something much bigger than either of us had anticipated. Rachel's D-contact came back with information that made my blood run cold. Margaret wasn't just some overzealous HOA president. With control issues, she was the final link in an international drug trafficking network that stretched from the cartels in Mexico through Nevada all the way up to Canada. The natural cave system beneath my cabin and the surrounding forest had been serving as a massive underground storage facility for drug transshipment for the past 6 years, and Margaret needed complete control of the area to keep their operation running undetected. What I'd inherited from my uncle wasn't just a peaceful mountain retreat. It was sitting directly on top of the main entrance to what the D suspected was one of the largest drug storage and distribution centers in the western United States. The revelation about Margaret's true background hit me like a tactical flashbang. According to Rachel's research, Margaret Stonefield had once been a successful real estate attorney in Las Vegas, handling million-dollar property deals and living the high life with her investment banker husband. But 4 years ago, her world collapsed when her husband cleaned out their joint accounts, divorced her for his 26-year-old secretary, and left her holding the bag for $3 million in bad real estate investments. The betrayal didn't just bankrupt her financially, it broke something. It's fundamental in her psyche. She'd gone from being a respected professional with control over her life to being a discarded, middle-aged woman with nothing but debt and rage. That's when the Morales cartel approached her with an offer that promised not just money, but the kind of absolute power she craved to ensure she'd never be vulnerable to betrayal again. Rachel continued digging through her D-contacts while I processed this information, and what she found painted an even darker picture. Marcus, she's not just working with the cartel. She's become their American operations manager for this entire region, Rachel said, showing me surveillance photos on her phone. Look at this. 18 families in the surrounding area have been systematically intimidated into selling their properties below market value over the past 3 years. She uses her HOA position as cover, filing frivolous lawsuits, creating fake building code violations, even organizing harassment campaigns to make people's lives miserable until they give up and move away. The photos showed Margaret meeting with men in expensive suits outside various properties. Always the same pattern: intimidation, legal pressure, forced sales, and then immediate resale to shell companies connected to Mountain Development Solutions. That's when Robert Martinez showed up at my door, a weathered man in his 50s. Paint-stained work clothes and carrying a tool bag that had seen better decades. "Heard you were having trouble with Margaret," he said, extending a calloused hand. "I'm Robert. Used to own 12 acres adjacent to your property until that witch made my life hell for 9 months straight." His story was heartbreakingly familiar: noise complaints about his carpentry workshop, fake environmental violations claiming his wood stain was contaminating groundwater, and anonymous tips to county inspectors about non-existent safety hazards. She offered me $35,000 for land worth 4 times that. Said if I didn't take it, she'd tie me up in court until I lost everything anyway. I finally sold just to escape the harassment, biggest mistake of my life. But Robert had information. That made my tactical training kick into high gear. The weird thing was, after I moved out, I kept driving by the old place for sentimental reasons, you know? I started seeing these big trucks with Mexican plates coming and going at night, always around 2 or 3 in the morning. They'd disappear into the forest behind what used to be my workshop and come back out empty hours later. He pulled out his phone and showed me grainy photos he'd taken from the road. I thought maybe it was logging equipment at first, but loggers don't work in the middle of the night and they don't have armed guards riding shotgun. The images clearly showed heavily loaded tractor trailers with armed men and tactical gear, exactly the kind of security you'd expect for high-value drug shipments. Rachel was already on her second call with D headquarters when Margaret made her next move, and it was a doozy that confirmed everything we suspected. For black SUVs pulled into my driveway. and outstepped what looked like a low-budget version of a cartel intimidation squad. Margaret emerged from the lead vehicle, wearing designer clothes that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, flanked by 3 men in cheap suits who were trying way too hard to look like professionals, but had the dead eyes and gang tattoos that screamed cartel muscle. "Mr. Garrett," she called out in a voice dripping with fake politeness, "I think it's time we had a proper conversation about your future in this community." The irony wasn't lost on me that she was essentially threatening a tactical team with what amounted to mid-level drug dealers. But then again, Margaret had probably never encountered anyone who didn't fold under pressure. Robert took one look at Margaret's backup and went pale. "Those are some of the same guys I saw with the trucks," he whispered, confirming what we already suspected. "The tall one with the skull tattoo on his neck, he was always riding passenger in the lead vehicle. They're not just intimidation, Marcus. They're the real deal." That's when Rachel finished her call and came over with the kind of expression that meant federal law enforcement was about to become very interested in our little mountain community. "Good news and bad news," she said, pocketing her phone. "Good news is D has been tracking this operation for months, and they're thrilled to finally have ground-level intelligence. Bad news is Margaret just called in what they're pretty sure is a cleanup crew to eliminate witnesses." Margaret's voice carried across the yard as she continued her threats, apparently unaware that every word was being recorded by multiple federal agencies. "This neighborhood is going through some changes, Mr. Garrett, and people who resist those changes tend to find life very difficult. I'd hate for you to experience the kind of problems that encourage people to relocate quickly." Her 3 companions. "We're making it clear through body language and positioning that this wasn't a social call." They were establishing fields of fire and escape routes like professionals preparing for violence. But what Margaret didn't know was that while she was making threats, the agents were already moving into position around the forest, and her entire operation was about to become the subject of a federal takedown that had been months in the planning. When Robert showed me the photos of armed trucks disappearing into the forest behind his old property, I realized Margaret's network was bigger, more dangerous than any of us had imagined, and she was about to find out what happens when you threaten federal law enforcement officers, while Margaret was outside making threats with her cartel backup dancers. I remembered something my uncle had told me during his final weeks. "Marcus, if you ever find trouble at the cabin, check the old steamer trunk in the basement. Everything you need to know is in there." At the time, I thought he was just rambling about family photos and war medals, but now his words took on a completely different meaning. I excused myself from the tense standoff and headed downstairs, leaving Rachel and the team to keep an eye on Margaret's intimidation squad. What I found in that basement changed everything I thought I knew about my uncle's retirement years. The steamer trunk wasn't locked, but it was heavy as a coffin and filled with materials that made my blood run cold. Federal de-identification cards, surveillance equipment, detailed maps of the cave system beneath our property, and most shocking of all, a leather-bound journal. With 6 years' worth of meticulous notes about Margaret's drug operation, my uncle, just Harold Garrett, hadn't just been a retired federal judge living peacefully in the mountains. He'd been working undercover for the DE, documenting the entire Morales cartel operation from the inside, gathering evidence for what was supposed to be the largest drug bust in Nevada history. The journal entries were dated right up until 4 weeks before his death, and the final entry made my hand shake. Margaret suspects I know something. She's getting desperate. If something happens to me, everything Marcus needs is in the camera system. Tell him to look for the red light in the utility room. Following his cryptic instructions, I found a hidden panel behind the water heater that opened to reveal a sophisticated surveillance system that would have made NSA technicians jealous. Multiple monitors showed live feeds from dozens of cameras hidden throughout the cave system beneath our property cameras that had been recording every single drug transaction, every cartel meeting, every murder that had taken place underground for the past 6 years. But the most damning footage was stored on a secure server. Crystal clear video evidence of Margaret personally overseeing the execution of 4 people who had discovered her operation. A mining engineer who'd stumbled onto the caves during a geological survey, an investigative journalist from Las Vegas who'd been tracking property acquisitions in the area, and most shocking of all, Sheriff Michael Harrison, who'd grown a conscience and threatened to expose the whole operation, and a federal inspector who'd gotten too close to the truth. The server contained terabytes of evidence that would not only put Margaret away for life, but would also take down the entire network she'd been protecting. Financial records showing money laundering through Mountain Development Solutions, detailed organizational charts of the cartel hierarchy, shipping manifests for drug shipments worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and most importantly, a comprehensive list of every official who'd been bought off to keep the operation running smoothly. My uncle had been building a case that would have dismantled one of the largest drug trafficking operations in North American history. Died before he could deliver the evidence to his handlers. I called Rachel down to see what I'd discovered, and her reaction confirmed the magnitude of what we were dealing with. "Marcus, this is incredible," she said, scrolling through files that detailed every aspect of the operation. "Your uncle was Agent Harold Garrett, deep cover. He's a legend in federal law enforcement circles, officially retired, but everyone knew he was still working cases. We thought he'd died before completing his investigation, but he finished it." She pulled out her phone and started making calls. 2 contacts at D headquarters, her voice urgent as she explained what we'd found. This evidence could take down not just Margaret's operation, but the entire Morales network in the American Southwest. We're talking about arrests that would span 3 countries and involve hundreds of suspects. But the most important discovery was my uncle's final plan, outlined in a detailed memo marked Operation Mountain Justice. He'd anticipated that something might happen to him before he could deliver the evidence personally, so he'd designed a failsafe that would automatically trigger a massive federal response if certain conditions were met. The cameras weren't just recording for evidence, they were connected to a dead man's switch that would simultaneously alert D, FBI, Border Patrol, and local law enforcement if the operation was threatened with exposure. All I had to do was activate the system, and within hours, every federal agency in the region would descend on Margaret's operation like the wrath of God. That's when Agent Lisa Hawthorne arrived at my door, stern woman in her 40s who introduced herself as the DH agent who'd been working with my uncle for the past 4 years. "Mr. Garrett, I'm sorry for your loss. I need you to know that your uncle was one of the most effective undercover agents we've ever worked with," she said, showing me credentials that confirmed her authority. He'd been feeding us intelligence about this operation for months, but we were waiting for the right moment to move. Margaret's escalation, today threatening a federal officer, gives us the legal justification we need to activate the takedown. Her arrival meant that the federal response my uncle had planned was already in motion, and Margaret's little intimidation visit had just triggered a law enforcement response she never saw coming. Agent Hawthorne's investment in this case became clear when she explained her motivation for pursuing Margaret's network with such dedication. 18 years ago, I've been tracking the Morales cartel ever since, and your uncle's intelligence finally gave us the tools we need to shut them down permanently. This isn't just about justice for him, it's about preventing thousands of other families from losing someone they love to these bastards. Her connection to the case meant she'd be relentless in pursuing Margaret and her associates. Her federal authority meant she could bring resources to bear that local law enforcement could never match. Outside, Margaret was still making threats and positioning her cartel muscle for what she probably thought would be a simple intimidation session, completely unaware that federal agents were already moving into position around the forest. "Agent." Hawthorne smiled grimly as she watched Margaret through the window, then turned to me with the kind of expression that meant justice was finally coming. "Mr. Garrett, Margaret has no idea that she just walked into a trap. Your uncle spent 6 years setting up, and now we're about to spring it." Agent Hawthorne had barely finished explaining the federal response when Margaret's desperation reached a whole new level of stupid. Through the window, we watched her pull out her phone and make what had to be the most incriminating call of her criminal career, speaking loudly enough for our surveillance equipment to pick up every word. "Listen to me very carefully," she hissed into the phone. "I need the cleanup crew here now. We have a federal problem, and it needs to be eliminated permanently before this whole operation gets exposed." What Margaret didn't know was that Agent Hawthorne had already activated a federal wiretap on her phone, and every word she